I've been expecting you. Solomon, what an enigma. He's popping up everywhere. Forgive me, we've not been formally introduced. My name is unimportant, really. You didn't travel all this way to learn my name. You traveled all this way because I'm an expert. I'm an expert in the terrors of the night, and I'm not afraid to spit my own imprecations at those who warrant them. Yes, I see you've been admiring my library. I have read all of these books and more, you know. The topic that I look forward to sharing with you today is a vast and fascinating one. Crossing paths with an enemy and wanting revenge after they have done wrong to you is nothing new. And when options are determined by polite society, situations become difficult to handle. However, there are options and there are means of taking action that's necessary. The people that knew most about how to take action when necessary in the most unorthodox means were the ancient Egyptians. The ancient Egyptians are known for not being strangers to the mystical arts and esoteric practices, and they had many different tools in their tool chest they were not afraid to use, one of which was execration magic. Execration magic is the practice of destroying or harming another through magical means. They used many different means of execration magic, and we'll be talking about a specific practice or technique, and that is the creation, and I like to say birth, of an execration figure. Execration figures are personal representation of another individual. In the case of Egypt, especially the pre-dynastic period, execration figures could represent entire nations of people. The execration figures in general have and share a very specific form, and that form is something that is seen throughout Egyptian art. The imagery consists of individuals, or prisoners you could say, or victims, that are bound. That is a very important aspect of these figures, is the binding of them. They are bound in such a way that they are completely helpless and powerless. And there are two key features of this binding that is very important to note. One is with the arms and one is with the legs. The arms are always bound behind the back, usually by the elbows, in a very uncomfortable manner, or bound by the wrists, still behind the back. In addition to the arms, the legs are often bound, and usually by the ankles. When in a standing form, the ankles are bound. When in the kneeling position, which is also a very artistic and stylized image that is seen throughout Egyptian art and furniture, the individual is kneeling, still with the arms bound behind the back, but the knees are bent and they rest on the legs while the ankles are bound as well. Then, in addition to this, but not always the case, especially in the kneeling position, the neck is tilted back in a severe arch. Overall, this imagery, and this very stylized imagery as well, clearly depicts whoever this is that is in this form as being helpless and powerless, which I do believe is the main point of the entire execration figure, to render an individual or a nation completely powerless and under your control. In addition to this, some execration figures, some that were carved out of stone, had piercings right through the neck, either this way or this way. That piercing would then have a cord placed through it, to almost symbolically give the owner of the execration figure the power to pull their prisoner or their victim by the neck, to have them by the throat. This practice of creating an individual and presenting them in a way that you wish them to be is a form of sympathetic magic, which is the practice of creating or presenting the way in which you envision something in a physical form. In a sense, it's very crafty, but it also is very powerful as well. The imagery of the bound figure that is permeated throughout Egyptian art is found primarily within royal environments. This imagery began being first seen in the pre-dynastic period. However, it continued throughout the Three Kingdoms and into the late period. An example of this is seen on King Narmer's palette. King Narmer is seen on the back of his pallet in the position as all pharaohs are when they are about to strike and kill. His arm is raised holding his weapon. In his other hand, he is gripping a bound captive in the way I've described earlier, kneeling, holding them by the hair, and he is in mid-swing to kill this individual. Unlike having his hand on his side holding his weapon, by having it raised holding the weapon, death is certain. In the sky, we see the god Horus in his hawk form. He too is also holding Lower Egypt under control and under King Narmer's power. He pulls with his talons a rope that is tied around Lower Egypt, symbolically representing the power that King Narmer has now over Lower Egypt. King Narmer was integral in the unification of Egypt from both Lower and Upper. However, his unification was very brutal, and it involved a great deal of force. Later, we see another form of the bound captive in the form of a sandal, or at least the sole of a sandal, in King Tutankhamun's tomb. On the sole of his sandals that he would have worn in the afterlife, we see the bound captive both in kneeling position and also in standing position, as if where his foot would rest he would keep these down. He'd keep these potential oppressors down permanently in the afterlife as well. Later we see King Ramses III in the late period, flanking either side of his window of appearance himself, depicted as smiting and killing very much the same way as seen on the back of King Narmer's pallet. He is doing the same to a prisoner there, as well as underneath the window there is a collection of severed heads that he is cut off himself and placed there. They're not actual heads that he's severed, of course, but these are symbolic representations of what he's done. What we have to consider is what makes this imagery so significant that it would be transferred from royal sympathetic magic into personalized sympathetic magic. The significance of this imagery lies in the symbolic value and also in the perceived magical power of it. If this kind of imagery was used by the kings and used by the royals in such dramatic political and divine manners, then of course it's going to be powerful elsewhere. And this is why the transference is appropriate, from being out in the public view to being in a very personal space, used in the execrative magic that we're talking about and used in the form of the execrative figures. What we do need to address is who potentially came up with this imagery, and how did it come to be? The lectors were part of the priestly order, and most likely the individuals that developed the bound figure motif found within Egyptian royal art, as well as the form associated with the execration figures we've been speaking about. To become a lector, you had to go through the same process as becoming a priest. However, as a lector, you were not necessarily a priest, and yet, at the same time, in most rituals, lectors were the ones that conducted the rituals, not the priests. To become a lector, you had to become a priest, but even at that, it was required, more knowledge was required for it, and there were even levels within becoming a lector. The placement or the level in which you would become a lector based on it being part of the priestly teachings is not entirely clear. However, it is clear that becoming one lector meant that you would be able to develop your knowledge and move further up the ranks in becoming another lector. Lectors were associated with very specific tasks, and as I mentioned, they were the ones that conducted ritual. It was not the priests, and often ritual was both public and private, and they were the ones that would run these, along with priestesses, however. Along with public and the performative aspects of ritual, lectors were known for being part of the healing procedures, as in simple or very GP, general practitioner style doctor healing treatments, as well as they were the embalmers. They were the ones that conducted all of the key rituals associated with the mummifying process. In addition to this, lectors also were available within temples later on in time to provide services within the realm of spell work for common individuals coming into the temple, as well as, of course, privately for all the royals. Lectors' knowledge and skill set spanned a great deal, and they, because of this, had a great deal of stature within Egyptian society, and they were looked upon with great reverence. Lectors, when practicing many of their different works, methods, techniques, they had specific approaches for specific activities. And when we focus on execration magic, it's tempting to go outside of it because some of the different techniques used within the execrative magic practices also were sometimes used in other areas. And what I mean by this is in relationship to the use of spit and bodily secretions. Spit was a very important part of the ritual process for lector practicing, or for the practice of lectors, simply because it was an extension of the magician or the creator's self. Gotta remember, when you're conducting sympathetic magic, you put yourself in the place of God, and then with your breath and with your spit and your saliva, then it acts as a symbol in the way God's spit or saliva would as well. So in the case of execrative magic, spit is very integral. Spit can be considered an extension of yourself and be mixed in with whatever it is you're using to, in a sense, put yourself in that piece if you need to. However, spit can also be used in a repulsive manner, referred to as filth, or the disgusting bacteria-filled viral excretion that is just the ultimate. It's almost like urine, which also is used, a very important thing that's also used. But we're going to first talk about spit. So by spitting on something, and especially your execration figure, it is an expellation of negative, you could say, energy, or the waste from your body, flicking it onto this individual. Symbolically, you're throwing filth onto this individual by spitting, and spitting was used for this purpose by the lectors in this way. Another interesting aspect of, once again, oral-related secretions, the breath. The breath of the lector was very important in giving life to something. So I suppose in the case of a execration figure that needed to be brought to life in some capacity, blowing your breath onto it was representative of giving life to the creature that you had just made. Other bodily fluids, including feces and urine, were used, as well as sweat. And all of these things would be mixed either if it was collected from the individual that the execration figure was representing, or it was simply used as a means of destroying the execration figure, i.e. urinating on it and dissolving it. Now, I mentioned dissolving, which means I need to bring up with you another aspect of the execration figures. Now, the execration figures were made out of a multitude of substances, but especially substances that were malleable for the work that would be involving more negative and harmful procedures done to the execration figure. Some execration figures, as I mentioned earlier, would be made out of stone or wood and could be carried almost as a form of amulet to have control perpetually over whatever this particular individual represented. However, the other more malleable substances that were rather popular were both wax and also clay. And now the clay has a very important meaning behind using it for an execration figure. In Egyptian society and also early Egyptian creation stories, there's a very important aspect to consider. Egypt is developed along the Nile. That's where Egyptian civilization developed. And with the Nile comes floods, yearly floods. And with the floods come silt and clay all along the coast. So clay is very rich in this area, and this is why there is a great deal of exquisite pottery that is left since the last time they were made. However, other things have also been made with clay, involving the early creation story of Khnum. Khnum collected the clay from the Nile, and he shaped man out of it, and man was made from the clay of the Nile. So the use of clay for execration figures is very important because you're using the same material that God would have used to create life. So therefore, by you collecting clay from the Nile and then going and creating your execration figure gives life to this creature, gives life to this being that you will then do whatever you want with. Wax was also used because it melted very well on fires. But when I mentioned earlier the idea of urinating on your execration figure to destroy it, the clay that was used to create execration figures was never fired. So by urinating on an execration figure after working on it shows the dissolving dissipation of your enemy by your own urine, by your own filth. By filth, you destroy your own enemy. So there's a lot of wonderful symbolism that's associated with it that was used and were integral techniques used by the lectors in the creation of execration magic, among many other forms. Now, after all this talk of bodily fluids and being utilized in execrative magic and the origin story of clay and humans, I think it's time that we go and we experiment and make our own execration figure. I personally like to work by the fire for something like this because, well, as you know, some of the execration figures need to be burnt after they're made. I may or may not be doing this, however, I do feel it's most comfortable being by a fire source, working on something like this. So, as we work through, the fire might die out, but what I'm going to point out first is the products that you need for doing this. I slipped into something a bit more comfortable so I can work more happily while doing this. Oh, the fire just went out. I'm going to pop another little bit of kindling in here. But one of the first things you need, pardon me, I'm lacking one of them. First thing you need is clay. I may not have clay from the Nile, but I do have clay. This happens to be from the Seattle company. I have a few paintbrushes for smoothing, so a lot of the things you'd be using for just working on clay with to begin with. I have some twine for when we're binding the figure's legs and arms. I also happen to have a reed pen. So the ancient Egyptians would have used reeds, and then that would have been during the pre-dynasty period onward through the kingdoms, but then it was at the later period during King Ramses III, his time, that these started being used. So I actually happen to have one of these. I have two inks. I have a black ink and I have a red ink. The black ink would have been made out of carbon, and the red ink would have been made out of red iron oxide in Egypt. The inks were not made with plant materials, they were made out of minerals. In addition, I have brought out my scissors for cutting twine. You can also use a knife. And I also have my notebook. And in my notebook, I have my incantation that I have chosen to use, which I have extracted from papyrus Ebers 131. So I've taken a piece from a piece of papyrus, or like a written word from a piece of papyrus, as well as I've also used a bit from the Book of the Dead, the Egyptian Book of the Dead. I would argue that the Egyptian Book of the Dead is not a very good resource for something like that, because that book was designed primarily for people in the afterlife, so all of those practices aren't going to really work the same way in life. Nonetheless, it offered some translations, which is actually in a Latin pronunciation of Egyptian. So imagine Egyptian, but with like a Latin accent, essentially. Also, we don't exactly know how Egyptian was pronounced. So at least the Book of the Dead has a phonetic spelling and a pronunciation guide, which is where I got that from. So while we begin our work, and one thing I will note is the figure that I'm going to be working on right now, and if you want to follow along with me, is based on the figures found in the cache that was dated for the Middle Kingdom. And the key factor about these particular figures, unlike my figures that I have here as example, which I'll show you in a moment, the figure that we're going to be working on has a bit more of a flat tablet-like surface to their body.
So it ended up having a flat surface so that it would be great to write on, which, as we know, that's an important part of the entire process. Put that there. This particular figure that I have here, as you can see, I've designed it so that it's in that kneeling sort of bound figure structure. The arms are tied at the elbows stylistically, the feet at the ankles are bound, and the head is tilted back as well. I have put a cord through the neck so that I can also pull this enemy and have this enemy by the throat. It is a he. I have carved in his name in a bit more of a stylistic manner so we don't get caught up with who it could be or who it couldn't be. And I've also written my incantation on the chest in red. And the use of the red ink is very important versus the black. The red ink was used in this process by the lectors and by the Egyptians specifically for the purpose that red ink induces a lot of, or it's associated with anxiety and anger and hostility. Not in like the drawings and art that would be in the tombs and whatnot, but in this particular practice. So oh, my foot just came off. In execaric, in this application, the red actually is appropriate for this. Here I have another individual. This individual here is also bound, but he is in the standing form. So I have his wrists bound at the back, but he's standing. I'll tie some twine around his ankles later. For the pip, I'm just letting him dry. And for those of you that are aware of clay sort of terminology, these guys are in the greenware stage, so he'll be perfect to write on. The figure that we're going to be making together in a moment is not going to be ready for writing on, so you might want to let them dry first before actually composing your written word on onto the chest of your individual. So while we're constructing our figure, we need to be considering some key factors. We need to be thinking about the individual that we are recreating in our clay. We need to be imagining them, and we need to also be thinking about what we want to have happen to them. So as you squeeze it, you put it into it as you're doing this. Only thing that I'm not displaying here, because this is more of a sampler or an example guy, is you should have some items or pieces of the person if you can. That can be clothing or hair or fingernails. Even if you have a writing sample, you want to place it in the clay, and as you're shaping it into the figure. So with this, you don't have to worry about getting the air bubbles out, because as you remember, all of these figures are completely unfired, and that adds to their ability to be destroyed, if that's the case, if that's what you want to do in the end. So that's something to consider. You can just squeeze it and sort of think about all that stuff. While I squeeze this, I'm going to talk about a few things with you. So, and as I shape, but as I do that, I'm actually going to get the fire going back again. So there is an account, a historical account, where the practice of execration-based magic so it's hard when you don't have a bunch of logs to go with it. Anyway, it's more of the vibe. There is an account of a historical excretion magic being utilized on a pharaoh, and that was King Ramses III. That guy sure had a lot going on, hey? Remember I mentioned him earlier in regards to his appearance window and having a relief on either side flanking the appearance window, with him essentially dominating a tiny person on either side in the excavation figure format and bound. Anyway, his second wife, who was a lesser wife, because you know there's lots of wives that the pharaohs went through, and not to mention the harems as well. But his second wife wanted her son to be the next in line for the throne, and so she incited support, which was cool, from a lot of the people from the court, including the lectors and also the harem ladies. And they actually, together, all worked to create a full-on campaign based on magic, excavation magic to be particular, to be exact, to bring him down. Now, King Ramses III ended up dying. He was assassinated successfully during this venture, but her son did not make it to the throne. Mind you, I will add, at this point in time within Egyptian history, this was when essentially Egypt was on its way out, and Greece and Rome were on the horizon for taking over. In fact, Greece was already primarily involved, and soon Rome would follow. So anyway, this was essentially the last of like the true the true Egyptian leaders to run both Upper and Lower Egypt as a unified force. Anyway, what this whole situation was known as is the Harem Conspiracy, because the harem ladies played a very key part in this particular ritual, you could say. That was because they were able to go and extract, or collect, I should say, items off of King Ramses III and his bodyguards for the creation of many of these little guys. A whole bunch of excavation figures of King Ramses III and his bodyguards. Their particular figures were made out of wax and were burned, but many different things were going on there, including urine and feces and all kinds of stuff. But there's an example of it being in Egyptian politics, which is rather interesting. So as I mentioned, this guy's going to be super rough. Nothing too big, just to give you an idea of what's going on here. So I would imagine that it'd be nice like that. See how I cut them open? And that's where you can place your goods. On this guy, I also did the chest as well. Big thing though with these ones is how they had a very flat chest and almost a unisex sort of body. This guy has a little bit of an alien head going on. But the key thing with these figures is that their arms, alright, are bound at the back. Okay. So you can take this to whatever extent you would like. You can make things really detailed. Like this guy, on both of these guys, I put genitalia on them to denote their sex. I also did stuff to the hair and the back and the arms, but you can get as creative as you want. And in fact, a part of the action of developing your creature has a lot to do with the meditative process of creating them. For now, so that we can keep things within a timeline that's effective, I'm going to leave him like this. I'm going to just adjust the bizarre eyes a bit. So in this case, we could leave this one as is, and we could prepare this guy, let him dry and get to greenware state, and then we can take our reed and our ink and we can write our incantations on it. So in that case, I'm going to be taking this guy and doing that for you instead. So I'm going to be writing, this is the phoneticized Egyptian. Maket tehuti beka apahatat tera. That's what's going to be written on this guy. And my incantation in English, I'm going to be saying over this individual is, perish just as you came into being. His heart is flooded and his limbs are weak. And that will be what's going on for this individual. I would like to add as I do this that you might have thought, and I'll say you thought correctly, but these execration figures could be called the earliest form of voodoo doll. It's undeniable seeing the similarities between these, yet one clearly has formed from an earlier point. I'm not saying that there aren't voodoo dolls or even execration figures in different cultures. I would be surprised if there weren't. But what I'm saying for recorded ancient civilizations, the Egyptians, they champion. They take that. And remember, the whole time you're doing this, what's very important is to be thinking about the individual and imagining your intent, which is what you're writing on your execration figure. The phoneticized Egyptian that I have, that I'm using here, what it says, and it's important, is under the guidance of Thoth, weaken and be in pain. Now the reason I use Thoth is that Thoth had to often be called upon by the lectors because Thoth was the god of knowledge. Thoth himself was a form of magician, you could say. So we're going to let that dry. And Thoth was the god of the lectors. And I say of the lectors, not necessarily the priests. That essentially concludes the construction of a execration figure. I hope that you enjoy dabbling in this yourself.
In closing, there has been a thought that I've had for quite some time. And it wasn't until I read a wonderful paper by David Frankenfurter that my questions and my thoughts were both validated and also expanded on. When it comes to the practice that we have discussed today of execraic magic, or magic for any matter, we have to consider the knowledge required in order to effectively execute such beliefs or work. We can dabble with execration figures that were made in the past by experienced and skilled lectors of Egypt. Our effectiveness of the creation and goal of our execration figures are not guaranteed because we do not share the same understanding and the same level of knowledge and experience that the lectors did. That is not to say that someone cannot strive to learn and respectfully understand the practices and potentially properly and truly effect what they want. But I think it's important to understand and respect that nothing like this is just an easy thing where you pick up a book or you watch a YouTube video and boom, suddenly you're a lector. It's not like that. It requires work. It requires commitment. It requires knowledge. And this is what David Frankenfurter talked about. With the practice of execration or execrative magic comes the ability to practice fruitful fertility, prosperity magic, the ability to bless someone and to protect them. Your effectiveness of being able to provide a effective protective talisman is going to be a representation of how effective your execration magic will be. And that is because in order for you to practice either one of these, you must have a skill and knowledge that will enable you to be balanced in your work that you conduct. As it is with any profession, as it is with any revered understanding of any practice that requires knowledge, you must learn it. And learning these things are a slow process. I have enjoyed working with you on making an execration figure. I have loved the experimentation in creating my own, and many, artistically, spiritually, and on many levels. But I don't believe that it's right for us to claim that we are going to go and act out the exact same things that the lectors of Egypt spent many, many years developing and working through, and they are not here today to communicate with us about what their plans and how they went through it, nor is it guaranteed that they would want to, because any of these things, any of these secret practices, requires a level of trust and exchange between the mentor and the student. Remember, magic is knowledge, and knowledge is magic.